Victoria Whalen, welcome to Troublemakers.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You've been here at the Climate Camp at TCDC in Arusha. How's it been so far?
So far, so good. Beautiful country, beautiful location. This campus is just really stunning, and just like all of the local flora and like fauna. I'm being obsessed with like the jacarandas and the monkeys going around, and just also being surrounded by so many people that I wouldn't normally interact with except on like the international like conference scene when we're all just stressed and running around, so we don't really get to engage, like actually build those relationships and connections. So it's nice to be in this area that's just like really focused on youth, climate justice, and just like relationship building. So I'm really happy to be here.
Super. I love those jacarandas, and this is like the exact right time of the year where that deep purple flower is falling all over the ground.
Yes,
there
it's
may
like
be no
snowfall.
rain, but yeah, it's like snowfall. Exactly. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
You came at the right time.
Been watching out though for the monkeys, because sometimes the branches will fall and I'm like, okay, that's a little too close. But yeah, it's stunning. It's the first time I've seen them before, so I'm like, just like taking in the beauty.
Do you think we are as naughty as monkeys are?
I definitely think we are. Those are our ancestors. We come from apes and monkeys, and so I think we have this like tightness. We have this.
Yeah.
We can see each other. Like when they look down at me and I'm looking up at them, I'm like, you are up to something, and I'm also up to something. I feel like we all have this kind of like kind of wanted to make something happen, and I feel like that's what monkeys do all the time. They're just going from tree to tree, and that's kind of what I want to do, go from tree to tree and just like stir things up.
Yeah, definitely. So often in the movement, we're kind of afraid of the law. We look at the law as something that oppresses us, something that people in power wield over us and sort of like bend to their will, and there are these legal systems that kind of control our lives. But you are using the law for the greater good.
Yes.
Can you tell us
yes.
about some of that?
Definitely. And I just want to say that there are multiple instances and it's right for people to fear the law. And there's just historical things that come out of that, and historical oppression and suppression of people. But really, the law is supposed to be for the people, by the people. And that's what I think this generation is really trying to bring back, especially in this kind of anti-colonial sense. I feel like nowadays the law is also just really colonial. It's really westernized, and it's really also framed in lots of academics instead of going back to like traditional law, indigenous law, and things like that. And so I originally did not even want to pursue law. I always was kind of interested in it, but I really wanted to focus my studies on children and solving pediatric diseases. So I actually have a biology degree. And then I entered undergrad, and I added a second major, which was urban and environmental sustainability. And one of the classes I took was environmental justice. And that was the first time that I had a framework or someone in academics with some sort of power and knowledge to tell me like the actual definitions of what my lived experience was. And it kind of just all clicked for me, because I always was about saving children, protecting other people, but I wanted to do that more on the science lens. But then I was like, wait, I'm also experiencing these environmental harms, these environmental destructions. I'm a lifelong asthmatic because I was living next to paper mills and oil factories down south in Georgia. And I was like, my experience is not in a silo. So many other Black, brown, indigenous people of color are also experiencing this, and also low-income people. And so all of a sudden in my last 2 semesters, I added a law and ethics degree, and I was like, I'm going to go to law, and I'm going to use my science, I'm going to use my storytelling, and I'm going to use the law to become literally a tool so that I can become a better activist and a better advocate for those little Black, brown girls who are having difficulties breathing or cannot source clean water, or their homes are being pushed out because of green gentrification and things like that. And so knowing that I'm first generation undergrad, first generation law, so it was very much a new thing. I only experienced law from what you see in the movies and what you see in TV, which is very much like, big, scary, very sensationalized. And it also has that thing of oppression. And especially being a Black woman from the South, I know that the law was not for me for a very long time, especially in the United States. It took up until, the 40s, the 60s, and for Black people to really get rights, and for really to have the legal system support us, and we're still not really supported in that sense. And so, but attending law school, I just graduated, and I realized that it really is how you make it. It's whatever you do, whatever you want to do. You take the readings, you take all these case laws, you take all of these studies, and you bring it back to your community, because that's what it's all about. I think like the biggest issue with law is that people think it's so high up, it's so multilateral, it's the highest systems, when actually the best way to use your law is your local governments. It's your city councils, it's your state councils, it's your tribes, it's your local, it's the people around you. And I really believe that the law is really what you make it. And it might be difficult, and it is very highly inaccessible, but that is kind of what me, my organization are trying to overcome. We're trying to make it as accessible to the most bottom, grassroots, local organizations, local people, local advocates, youth, and Indigenous people as possible, because those are the voices that are currently left out. And I think that's a big gap and issue in the legal systems currently, is that there aren't the voices that need to be there. And it's these experts and it's these judges that don't really have the general knowledge of the issue, and especially when you're thinking about like climate change and climate litigation. They really don't know the impacts. They also don't know the psychological, or they don't know the human rights impacts. And it's very much just like data, statistics. And it's like, people aren't numbers. People have their own stories. People have their own emotions. People have their own solutions as well. And that's kind of also what's lacking in the law, is that they take the harms and they don't take the solutions. They kind of cut it there, and they then offer reparations, or they wait until the harm has already happened and they're like, we're sorry your house is now flooded, or we're sorry that everything is burned down because of this wildfire. Here's a couple $100 or whatever. But it's very like retroactive, when it really should be the opposite. It should be the foreseeability. We should be protecting people before the harms happen. And I think that's what needs to change in the current legal systems, and what hopefully me and my organization are going to do in the next couple of years.
So tell us more about that. What are some of the initiatives that you're up to?
Yes, definitely. So I am the co-executive director and project manager of an organization called the Future Generations Tribunal. We are now a year old, so we are just a little newborn baby of this initiative, but we are a global initiative trying to secure rights for future generations by empowering youth and children who are the next closest kin to the next generation, to show that they have the authority and that they are the decision makers, because they are inheriting this planet after us. And so knowing that these children, the next generation, they're going to be the ones who are creating the new policies, creating the new laws, creating the new government, we can really utilize them and emphasize them and put them up as these high-powered decision makers, because the youth voice is lacking in law, and especially the BIPOC and Indigenous youth voices. And so what we do is that we notice the lack of adjudication that's currently witnessing. And so, for example, in the recent climate litigations that we've been seeing kind of all around the world, most of them are coming from the global north. Most of them are like these big high-profile cases against like Shell or this, that, and the other. And that's just great and all, but it's not really getting to the heart of the problems. And also a lot of climate litigation actually doesn't even go through, doesn't get passed because of lack of standing and lack of that evidence. And so that is one of the biggest issues, is this kind of evidentiary burden that we have to overcome. And so the tribunal, what we want to do is we're going to host regional assemblies all around the world, kind of similar to these climate justice camps, where we are gathering about 200, 300 young children, mothers, Indigenous elders and wisdom keepers, and youth, to really come together to offer a platform to share their testimonies and their stories that's really hyper-focused on their region and the harms that are happening there, but also allowing a space for them to share their solutions and to share what they think will be better for the future generations. And out of that will come regional reports that will then feed into an international report. But the main thing that's coming out of it, and the main issue that I said with this evidentiary burden, is creating this huge, ever-evolving database that really shows that each person has a right to take their story to whatever form of governance or whatever form may be to really push for what they need. And it doesn't have to, like I said, you don't have to wait until the harm happens. You don't have to wait until you have a bunch of people that have a similar harm. It's showing that the individual itself has the authority, it has the credibility that their story and their harms are actually need to be addressed. And so hopefully by doing that and by having like this huge database that anybody can access, and not just for legal systems, you could also do it for policy work. So it doesn't have to be a court case. You can also try to change policy with it. You can bring it to the academic institutions and then the colleges and creating reports and things like that. It really is gathering the evidence from the people who really often don't have a voice or don't have a stage to share their voices or their stories. And that's the biggest thing. It's really bringing the people back to the law instead of the law kind of hovering over the people. And so by doing that, we're hoping to create this kind of positive feedback loop and ripple effect that shows that the people are worth it. The people are the evidence. It's not the harms that they're experiencing. It's the people themselves and what they're saying. And I also want to note that currently in law and in adjudication, the evidence that they seek, like I mentioned before, it's very statistical, it's very data driven, and that's all that they kind of see as evidence. And it's also testimonial based or like written out. And I think that's why a lot of people feel hindered or not supported by the legal system, because they're just forms of storytelling and their forms of evidence just aren't accepted as credible. And so what we also want to do is change how the legal system views harms. And so we're trying to, in our tribunals, our assemblies that we're hosting, we're not just limiting our testimonies to speeches and things like that. We're including artwork, we're including traditional dance, we're including poetry, we're including all forms of whatever it may be for someone to really enunciate what their harms are, and especially in their cultural language. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we want to change with the legal system. We want to make sure that it is as accessible as possible to the people, especially if we're talking about youth and children who might not have like that technical dialogue that really like hits to what the judges are wanting or the jurors are wanting or the experts. But it still matters. Their voices still matters. Their experience still matters. And so you have to kind of think about all of those things that come together when you're kind of addressing the law.
Sure. In a way, it seems like it's also tilting the kind of judicial culture toward being more human.
Exactly. It's bringing it back to the people, because the people, that's where it comes from. Like, we wouldn't have any legal systems, we wouldn't have law if it wasn't for somebody standing up and saying, this isn't right, we need someone to do something about this. And it's just unfortunate that we have kind of drifted away from those traditional forms of communication and forms of problem solving. You know, in traditional aspects, they gather around in circles and they just talk until the issues are resolved, or they have some forms of that, whereas nowadays you go into a courtroom, someone speaks on your behalf, a judge hits the gavel, and it's just so dry, and it just doesn't take into the heart of the emotional experience and the taxing experience. And I think that's what's lacking the most, and especially as we see climate anxiety and just general anxieties because of the way the world is going, especially with the war and conflict and all of these different natural disasters happening and just lots of climate migration and refugees and things like that. It takes a toll on people, and that emotional health is also never it's just never valued in the court system as well. There's like, I'll speak from a U.S. standpoint because that's where I got my law degree from. You kind of only see like emotional harm seen in like torts, for example, then it's just kind of like, oh, you saw this person in a car accident. Oh, that's terrible. We can give you like $100 for your emotional well-being because you have to go to a therapist. But that's the kind of extent of it, where it's like, no, it's kind of a longer thing. It's like a slow onset buildup of depression, of anxiety, of this kind of doomism, because as one person, you really don't know what you can do or what you should be able to do, because there's just so much information coming at you all at once. And unfortunately, a lot of it is sad, it's bad, it's catastrophic. And so that's also something that we want to highlight and change in this tribunal and also in the legal system, is that the people also should be the ones offering the solutions. It shouldn't just be the judges. It shouldn't just be the jurors that are the ones to say, oh, this is how this harm should be enacted. Because also you have to think the harms are going to be different from each person, from each community, from each state, from each country. And so to think that you can have this kind of umbrella, it's just not going to work. And I think that's where a lot of law fails, because it might seem to protect everybody, but in a sense, it is only protecting so-and-so, this and that, and not, encompassing what those people on ground actually need.
Victoria, I'd like to ask you about the interplay between legal strategies, legal approaches, and other forms of building and coalescing power. How do you see these legal strategies, interact or supplement or interplay with other approaches to get what we want?
Yeah, definitely. First and foremost, I'm an activist and an advocate by heart, by nature, by profession. That's just, I live and breathe that. And so I really think for me, it is involving all of the energy of the protest, of the activism. I know for me, I'm very much in an environmental justice grassroots organizer. That's where most of my local and U.S.-based advocacy efforts go to. And so I started off as the people that were in the streets, in the protests, shouting all the chants, being the moderators. My family's from upstate New York, and when I did my undergrad in the city, I had this interesting fellowship with an organization called New York Renews, where we were trying to create a state bill that was like a funding mechanism for this Climate Protection Act that they had recently passed. And a lot of my role in that, while yes, it was very policy heavy and like legal heavy, it was the advocacy side of things. It was really changing that language and making it accessible for the people, and then turning it into informational content, and then also then bringing that to the on-ground mobilizers, the grassroots organizers, the other activists, to then form all of these protests, to then form these different activities. We had we had this really amazing thing called the die-in, where we all just kind of showed up. We had different kind of tombstone markers that said different harms that were happening, and then we went in front of the state capitol and we were like, this is what we want. We had this whole speech, and then all of a sudden we all just kind of died, and we just laid down in front of the state capitol, and it was just like very impactful, and all of the assembly members and constituents were coming out, and it was just like so informed. And so I think like the importance is taking the law, taking the policy, and bringing it back to the people in the most accessible way possible. And I think that is one, changing the language, changing how it sounds to the everyday person, because like you said, it's very inaccessible, and bringing it to the advocates, to the activists, and being like, okay, this is what you have, this is what can serve you. Now take this, bring it back to your community, talk to your community members, and see what the best way to move forward is. For me, when I lived in Oregon, where I attended law school, I was really involved with the Eugene City Council and an organization called Fossil Free Eugene, where you're trying to make sure that the city of Eugene doesn't have any more fossil fuel buildings, especially residential buildings. And so one of the big parts of that was me just using my voice and using my story and going up to city council and being like, I might have this law degree, but first and foremost, I'm a Black person, I'm a woman, I'm low income, I'm an asthmatic, and this is my experience. And yes, now I have this law degree, so I might seem more elite and might, seem more credible, but at the end of the day, this is my lived experience, and this is what you need to know. And so I really think it is less about interacting the law with the activists, and I think it's more like, here, this is all that the information that you can have that's possible. Take what you will, and if it doesn't serve you, then that's great. Write that down, send it off to your policymakers, to your constituents, to this, that, and the other, and say, this is what's serving me, this is what isn't. Change it so that all of it can serve us. I think that's the most important thing, and especially when you go into these international spaces. I've been attending the COPs and the SBs for a couple of years now, fairly new, and that's kind of one of the this weird juxtaposition that I see in this international space where you attend these big global conferences and it's a lot of closed door meetings, behind the rooms, things like that, with all of these high level policymakers, high level government officials, and it's really not accessible to the civil society and grassroots organizers and youth that are on ground at these local institutions. And so then it leaves them to feel like they can't engage in that policy work, and then they are forced to then only be the activists and the advocates. And so then you'll see like all of these big meetings behind the closed doors, and then civil society are the ones outside doing the protests, doing the chants, being like, we demand this, we demand, a fossil fuel phase out, we want this in the text and things like that. And so I feel like if we can open the door for people as well, I think that's a big thing. Not just opening the door, but leaving it open. And that's kind of my motto, especially for environmental justice work in the United States. It's not just about leaving the door open. It's leaving it unlocked with a little door hinge, and so that it's a flow of air naturally coming in, so that people can then be informed while also then taking it back to these policy requests, to these protests. And then so hopefully it's all kind of interconnected, because right now it's very much protest or you're in the room where it's happening. And I think it should be a mix of both, where the protesters then go into the room and they are the ones that are also helping forming the policy, helping forming the laws, providing that guidance. I really think that the legal system often does lack, going into the local communities and really asking for the answers and for the solutions. And I don't know what the easiest way for that for that to happen, but I think with the tribunal, at least, we are trying to kind of poke and prod the minds of these higher officials, of these legal experts, of these judges, to really be like, it's the community, it's the people. If you want to be informed and if you want to have the best knowledge as possible and the most well-rounded approach to finding a solution, you have to talk to the people. You have to allow them into the rooms. You have to allow them into the courts. We're having I don't know if you've heard, but there is a big campaign that is happening at the International Court of Justice, the advisory opinion on climate change. It's the first of its kind. It's happening at The Hague. The oral arguments are happening the beginning of December. And even though that's about, a lot of the island nations and a lot of indigenous groups and what these states' obligations are to protecting people and, ending the harms on the climate crisis and what their state responsibility is, you still see that as very, very limited and not accessible to the people. Not many, it's a small space. Not many people can even sit into the hearings themselves. It might be live streamed, but then you also have to think most people might not have internet, might not have access to that type of technology. And then also is just the people that are speaking on behalf are the delegations of these nations and not necessarily the people from these nations. And so it's like, how can we then get the people involved, and how can we then have our own voices and stories that's also in kind of the highest level of government that we have in the world? And it's still lacking. It's still, the voices aren't there. It's like I said before, it's like that broad umbrella where it's like, great, but also it's not enough. We kind of have to flip it the other way around and really make it a boat filled with all of these people that are coming together from the most local communities. And I also think it's important to highlight not just the locals, not just the children, not just the youth, not just those most impacted, but you also do need to involve the businesses. You also do need to involve the institutions, the people that people might seem as kind of foes or like not true allies, because at the end of the day, we all also have to work together. The businesses have to get smarter. They have to get more transparent. They have to get more accountable for the people that are on ground, because, we're the ones that are buying their products. And if you are, I personally get all of my clothes secondhand and thrifted because, I don't want to support a business that believes in fast fashion and exploiting, labor of other people. And so I think there's also, it's just kind of, everything is just intersectional. And so it's like, you have to include all of those voices or else you're just going to miss something everywhere. You're not going to get all of the threads that are needed to be untied into a nice, neat bow. It's just never going to happen. It's always going to be knotty, and then it's always going to be tangled, and then you're just going to have to keep going back, and the process is going to get slower and less efficient because you're really having to backtrack on the things that she missed, when if you had those people in the room to begin with, I don't think that would happen.
Sure. At the ICJ, let's look at the best possible scenario. What would we win from it?
What would we win? We would win so much. To have the highest form of government say that states, that countries, that the heads of government have an obligation to protect their citizens from harms of the climate crisis, it would be, the ripple effects will be exponential. It really, not only will it force the governments and policymakers to actually include that into all of their decision making moving forward, it also gives back the voice to the people to show, hey, now your governments have to pay attention to this. So now you have the authority to actually bring your harms to your governments. Like, they have to do that. It's going to be
in a way that
amazing.
perhaps has more gravity to it than, say, the COP agreements or Paris agreements.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that's interesting, is because, like, the things that come out of the COPs, like you have the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, the Paris agreement, the Rio Declaration, things like that. Yes, those are super important. They have transformed our laws and governments as we know it, as the years gone by. But most people, they don't know what that means. They don't know the process. They don't know all that goes into it. And also, like I said, now being into this international spirit, seeing how it works and seeing how hard it is to just get one piece of just like equitable intersectional language in it. It's just so difficult. There are so many corners that are cut and so many people that are ignored and things that are like left out. It's like actually crazy. And they aren't that effective because they're also kind of they don't have any effective processes to actually enact them on ground and through these local communities. They're kind of these very lofty goals and like lofty theoretics that most people don't know how to engage in that. Whereas if you have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, have these like hardcore state obligations, it's written down, it's an effective mechanism. That's different. That actually means things can happen. You don't have to then do the extra work to be like, okay, we have the Paris Agreement, but how can we now put this into this? We have the ICJ. That's that. And now we can actually just bring the people. We can bring their stories. We can bring the harms and the troubles to our local governments. And I think it's really powerful. And I know the tribunal, we are super excited. And like I mentioned before, the ICJ in itself is still very inaccessible. Also, even just like where it's located, The Hague, the Netherlands, just like so global north, so far out there for most people. But what the tribunal is really excited about is that we are actually in conjunction and kind of parallel with the oral arguments that are happening. And like I said, we want to bring the people's voice into these hearings. We are having our own hearings outside of The Hague. We are putting on kind of this in partners with the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, who have been the biggest advocates for this, the AO campaign, as well as the World Youth for Climate Justice and a few other organizers. We are putting together kind of this big festival with the main point being this people's hearings, which is gathering local community members from all around the world, including like the Brazilian Amazon, including Sudan, Congo, including the Caribbean, including Bangladesh, all of these different regions, to host our own People's Assembly. Because like I said, to share their stories, to share their testimonies, to share their actual harms that are happening and the various degrees that they are happening in, and providing their solutions. And hopefully out of that, we're going to be producing some sort of outcomes document that then can be read on behalf of one of the nations that are pleading in the oral arguments, and so that you can actually see the people are outside, and even though they may be outside, their voices still get inside, and their voices are still being part of the change and the solution. So we're really excited about that, and I think that once again goes into how effective that the ICJ and this decision on the state's obligations on climate change can be, because it really will also then be informed by the people and not just the member states that are coming in, which is also important, but there will still be that people's perspective. And so I think it's going to be a really beautiful thing that everyone should look out for. And I think moving forward, it's going to change a lot, because even though it's really specific on climate change and the climate crisis, we know that it's intersectional. You can't talk about climate crisis and climate justice without talking about disability justice, without talking about social justice, without talking about war and conflict and money and finance and governance. Is like everything is connected, and women's rights and gender rights and children's rights. And so I really think that it's going to be a ripple effect that will then make state obligations and states obligatory to solve harms that aren't just the climate crisis. It's also related to like the gender gaps in law and in jobs and in wealth and things like that. Also the gaps in disability access and accessibility in that way, and also the gaps in making sure that youth and children have a seat at the table. And so I really think it's going to be a phenomenal ripple effect that will change law and policy as we know it into the international sphere.
So it's really nice to be in the presence of your optimism and hope when it comes to legal activism and its interplay with other forms of activism and people power. I want to kind of bring in maybe a quick anecdote that might fly in the face of that optimism, and I want to see kind of what you do with that. It comes from East Africa, but I think it might be anecdotal for many post-colonial states, because we know about, of course, the relationship between law and colonialism. It's very entrenched, and it's very globalized. So we've had many situations where we're standing in solidarity with communities that are trying to protect their land from state actors, from multinational companies, from fossil fuel companies, and often when a civil liberties lawyer or human rights lawyer comes in, they will say, leave it to me, right? I got you. We're going to file this thing in court. And often that depletes the momentum of a community that has been doing grassroots organizing, maybe courageous direct action, civil disobedience. And the lawyers will even caution against some of those tactics and strategies that communities are, putting their bodies on the line, taking big risks, putting their lives at risk, trying to protect their land or their resources. And we see a stagnation in their movement because lawyers have come in and said, we got you, we're going to take care of this. And often what they find, of course, no surprise, sometimes courts are corrupt, sometimes courts rule by law instead of, of law. And so they figure out what minor clauses can be used to continuously oppress and exploit the land and the people instead of, maybe just appealing to a constitutional, like a more paramount law that can, that could liberate the people. So there are all these different kinds of interests of capital, of state, of colonial powers at play. How would you look at those kind of situations?
Yeah, definitely. And all of you said is insanely accurate. And I'll start with
Does it ring true also in like Georgia or in New York?
It rings true everywhere. And I think it's the fault of our legal systems. And like you said, it's the fault of it being so colonial and so rooted in capitalism and so rooted in we have this kind of power over you, in a sense, and that's kind of goes into that inaccessibility. I'll go back to what you had started with about me being this kind of optimist, because that's, I think, how lawyers have to be. We have to be optimists, and for me, that's what makes the world go round. I think one of the biggest issues is falling into that the gloom and doom, and that's also kind of what stagnates the issue. And I think as a lawyer, like you said, they go into these areas and these movements, and they do halt it, they do stagnate it. And that's just the issue of law itself. It's so slow moving because it's not by the people, for the people. It's these experts, it's these people coming in and, for lack of a better terms, being kind of these white saviors coming into this community and being like, I have all the knowledge, I know what you need, leave it to me, like you said, and then you would just never hear from them. There's no more community engagement. There's just like, I got it, here we go, that's it. And then you don't hear from them, and then it's like you said, what do we do? And so I think that's what has to change. Lawyers need to realize that that at the end of the day, we serve the people. We can't just go in and introduce our own ideas, our own solutions, our own this, that, and the other, because at the end, that's not what's going to make the change. What you have to do is you have to go into these communities, and not just go into the communities and being like, hey, I'm here, what do you need? You need to go in beforehand, and you need to build those relationships. You need to make sure people are comfortable talking to you. I think that's also the biggest gap, is that there's not this relationship building. It's very much a transaction, and I think that goes to the capitalism and the colonialism. It's I'm providing this service for you, and you're going to pay me for this service, wherein actually I should be in service for you. You know what I mean? And
that dynamic could exist even where there's no payment.
Exactly. Like, it shouldn't be. And for me, going into kind of the legal field that I am, and I keep telling my mom, I'm like, I'm not going to be a rich lawyer. And that's not the type of law that I'm going to be in. It's not going to happen. I feel like if there's any type of case where I will just be too emotional, and I'm like, you know what? I got it for free. That's it. And I feel like most lawyers need to be on that kind of mindset. Like, if you're not going into big law or corporate law, you really do need to serve the people and be in service of the people without expecting any type of recognition or any type of reciprocity. And it really should, even though, you might be like, this is inefficient, and why do I have to go on ground and talk to all of these people and host all of these kind of town halls, or go like door to door and hearing these stories. Like, that's what wins the cases. One of my heroes, and kind of one of the reasons I got into this type of law, is Erin Brockovich, and very famous. She's not even a lawyer, but very, very famous in the United States, where she was just this kind of down and out single mom, low income, didn't really have anything to do. And then all of a sudden she saw an ad that they were looking for a paralegal, and she was like, I guess I can do that. I don't need a law degree. I don't really need to know anything except how to interact with people. And then she went into this one community who was being poisoned by the water and by the air, and they were dying from cancer. The children were dying from cancer. They were having all of these different health crises and things like that. And literally what she did, she would go door to door, and she would sit down with these families over meal, take down all of their history, take down their stories, take down from the moment they were born to the moment they were dying, and really building this relationship with this community to the point where she knew everybody's name, their phone number off the top of her head in each of their instances. And without even having a law degree, she just was a people person. And because of that, when they did take the corporation that was infecting their water to court, they won one of the biggest payouts and from a climate justice and an environmental justice standpoint. And it was because of her, and it was because of her people skills and bringing those stories. And then they had all of that evidence. They were like, oh, they could see the patterns of harms, and they could see what the people actually needed. And she also noted, like, if we only had like this kind of well, if we had these things from what the people were saying. And so I'm like, she had no law degree, and people kind of looked down on her, and yet she was the one that really made the change. And so I think more lawyers should be like that. I said, it should not be a transaction. It should be sitting down, joining the community members, listening to what they need, and then bringing it back to the lawyers, to your law firms, and being like, these are the people. How do we help the people? How do we get them the justice that they need? And I think that's, the heart of it. And that's what makes me an optimist, because I'm like, if she can do that, anybody can do that. Anybody can go in and ask for people to share their stories, as long as they are building that relationship, as long as they are being intentional, as long as they're not being extractive. Because I think that's also the other thing with law, and especially as it's so westernized and so colonialized, it is extractive. A lot of it is taking the harms and kind of like the traumas and really not doing much with it except using it and exploiting it in these cases and being like, oh, you see these people, oh, it's so harsh and it's so sad, like, please help us, etc. When it's like, these are still people at the end of the day, and you're still exploiting them, and it might not be exploiting their resources, but you're exploiting their emotions, you're exploiting their well-being, you're exploiting their stories. And I think that's also something that needs to change in the legal system, where once again, it goes to the power of testifying and the power of witnesses having their own authority and their own credibility as their selves, instead of just being a statistic and a number. And so I think that kind of answers your question, I hope.
So what I'm hearing is that if there are any, aspiring paralegals, lawyers, anybody who wants to work in the law, be a community organizer.
Exactly.
There's no way around it. You gotta get your start there, and then as you practice, you'll realize like how useful actually this is to achieving your goals.
No, literally, and that's really what I learned. Like, I was really scared entering law school. I really felt this imposter syndrome being like, and all these people in my classes either came from law families or came from, some sort of like legal background, or I went to undergrad specifically for law because they knew they were entering law school, when mine was kind of a last minute decision. I was like, well, I would like to have this kind of tool in my toolbox. And then I was just sitting there and just like listening to all these case laws and these different things, and then like the legal history of how laws are made and how policies are made. And like that was the reoccurring theme. It all starts from movements. Like, you look at the civil rights movement, that starts from people in the streets, people gathering together, doing the sit downs, doing the bus boycotts, being in the streets, going door to door, being like, this isn't right. You then also look at the labor union movements and how labor rights came to be. It was these people banding together and being like, we are being exploited. We are not getting anything that we should be. Our health is deteriorating because we don't have the best safety practices in these factories and things. You look at the women's rights movements, where they were realizing that, they were not getting paid. They were not being seen as people. It all comes from movements, and that's what changes the law. And so I think really we need to bring it. It always goes back to the movements. It always goes back to the people. And that's what legal systems now just don't realize. It's like, you're creating these laws, but let's actually think about where these laws came from. It came from someone coming together with another bunch of people and being like, this isn't right. We need to do something about it. Let's take it to the streets. Let's take it to the people. Let's do the chants. And that's also, it's that public pressure, and it's the pressure and I think that's, public pressure is a really hard thing for me too, because it shouldn't take that much pressure for something to happen. It shouldn't take these big movements, these big marches, these big things to happen. It really should be, like I said, that one person having the authority to make that change. But I think, at the end of the day, everything stems from movements, child rights, making sure that children aren't working in like sweatshops and things like that. That also came from movements, and that also came from rallying and boycotting and things like that. And so the people have the power. They've always had the power, and it's just putting it back into their hands and like reigniting that power. I feel like it's like a flame that's kind of dimmed down, but what I want to do, and hopefully my organization does, is like always reigniting it, always being that match to keep it lit, and being like, don't die down. Even though that's also a thing in legal court systems, where you might not have gotten the outcome at the end of the day of the big court case that you wanted, but all of that work leading up to it did something. There were little minute changes that were actually helping your fight for justice. And though that court case might not have won, you can always try again. You can always do something, do another type of policy paper, do another type of court case, do another this, that, and the other. And that you should see, it shouldn't take one giant win. You should also take in the little wins. And I think that also goes into being kind of like this hopeful optimist, where there's always something you can take out of the experience when you're dealing with the legal systems and when you're dealing with adjudication and policy making, that, at the end of the day, the goal might not have been reached, but you still did make those milestones.
Let's try to erode this hard wall between lawyers and the people a little bit more. What would you advise to somebody who's experienced a grave injustice, who feels like they can't afford a lawyer, they can't find a lawyer, they're afraid to talk to a lawyer? Where would you advise them to begin?
Oh, that's a good question. There are so many lawyers out there. Even speaking from the U.S., that I think that's like one of the biggest like professions that has like the most numbers. And so there's always going to be someone out there. There's always going to be a firm out there. There's always going to be that paralegal out there that will listen to your harms, that will really take your stories into consideration, that will really work with you. It really is just about, I hate to say it, just like doing the grinding work and like finding those resources. And one of the things of the tribunal is that we want to make those resources accessible. We want to have our database that also includes, who's doing the pro bono work, who's doing the indigenous work, who are the language providers. Because also a big thing is like language and accessibility. You also have to think when you're having these, when people have to, there's all these processes like depositions, and you have to go and tell your stories, and then it can take like hours, and then you have to go into the courts, and they can take hours, and they can take weeks. And it's like, if you're dealing with mothers, who's taking care of the children? If you're dealing with people who are low income, how are they going to, who might not have like transportation, how are they getting from one place to another? And so then it also comes into those things that you have to think about. And so it's like much more than just like getting the lawyer. It's then also getting the accessibility to actually be in the law sense and to actually put your case forward. And so I think really that is it's on the law firms, and it's on the lawyers themselves to provide those resources. I think really, I'm just such a community person. I think just relying on your community is the best way forward. And I think that I very much believe also in just like other mothering and just really being united. And I think that as long as you can have your community to support you, you can always get the change done, whether that be providing childcare, whether that be pulling together and doing like a carpool to the court or to the deposition, or whether that be some sort of like crowdfunding. I think there's always a way to get the justice that you need, and it just might take a little bit to get there, and it might be inefficient right now, but I think that goes to the endless hope. Like, you shouldn't stop. Don't see this as a full-on barrier, as a no crossing. Sees it more as of a hurdle that you need to jump over, and hurdles can be hard, but as long as you practice, you can finally get over it, and you'll get the justice that you need. I think in terms of accessibility, that's like really the heart of it. And really, like I said, just talking to the people and understanding what they need, and just not being kind of this savior umbrella form, being like, oh, there you go, let me just drop this off and you're good. I know I talked to at this initiative fair that we were having here at the climate justice camp, this one woman, she was doing great work in Puerto Rico, and she was saying how, these national organizations and things after the hurricanes would come and just like drop off all of these solar panel systems and like things like that to the communities, and then just leave, not providing any kind of resources, any technical dialogues, and just really relying on the community to figure it out themselves. And in turn, the community sat together and were like, okay, let's figure this out. And then let's go with ourselves, our communities, let's then go to the different communities and surrounding and teaching each other how to work in these best practices. And so I think that really is what it's about. It's just learning within your community and just having, someone on the outside being there to kind of support you and providing those resources, providing those numbers, providing those emails, and providing whatever you may need. But I really do think, as long as we're kind of grouped together with the community and with any kind of allies and activists, that change is inevitable, even though it might seem slow.
What's your favorite TV show or movie involving lawyers?
This was a good question. I mean, like I mentioned, Erin Brockovich. Everyone should watch Erin Brockovich. That's a great movie starring Julia Roberts, my queen. I love her. I think everyone should watch this. Another one of my favorite movies is A Time to Kill with Matthew McConaughey. Oh, I think I just butchered his last name. Samuel L. Jackson. And that one is really based off of the civil rights movement down south in Georgia. And I really think TV show, that's hard. I feel like I don't watch a lot of legal TV shows, because I feel like those are the most like sensationalized and the biggest things. But I know my mom and I, we used to love to watch Suits. I don't know if anyone's seen that. And it's kind of like less about climate justice and more definitely that big political lawyer field. But I also love that because at the end of the day, what I love most about the Suits show is he also didn't have a law degree at all, has no sorts of law degree. And he's
grifting.
Exactly, just grifting and just being like, hey, I have this skill that could be used for people to like help make change and like get justice for people. And I think that's really what it's all about. I really don't think you need a law degree to make change. Like for me, law and having this degree, it's just a tool in my toolbox. It's just a way for me to get more information and more knowledge to help the people and bring that back to my community. So definitely A Time to Kill, definitely Aaron Brockovich, Suits. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, those are some top threes for now. So earlier you alluded to Indigenous law. What is Indigenous law?
Indigenous law, that's a hard question. Indigenous law is whatever the traditional legal practices and traditional knowledge that, you know, any of these Indigenous and local communities have. I know for the Future Generations Tribunal, one of the main principles that we use is the 7th generation principle. And so that's kind of one of the things that we view as Indigenous law. And it's also, you know, it's called the 7th generations principle, but it has different names and all in different cultures and things like that. But really, to me, Indigenous law is just going back to the heart of the communities before the colonizers, before the capitalism, before the extractiveness, and really thinking about how we were working before it kind of all went downhill in a way, and really bringing back those traditional ways of thinking. And I know coming from having a science background, a big part of my science degree was traditional ecological knowledge and seeing the value of these communities and these cultures and these histories that were living for so long before, that were sustaining the land, that they were sustaining the people, they were sustaining their histories. And really, it was just beautiful and sustaining. And yeah, it's just sustaining the local flora and fauna for a better future for the next generations, the next 7 generations to come. And I think if we can bring more of that back into the legal sense, like, it's just like, it goes back to that ripple effect. If we are thinking about the next generations and the 7 generations to come, we are now thinking about the foreseeability. We're not being retroactive. We can now prevent the harms because we are focusing on those that are going to inherit our planet and our earth afterwards. And I think that's in a lot of Indigenous cultures. And even when indigeneity is also so broad and it's so complex, and so many different regions and nations and local communities describe it in different ways. And so it would be remiss or even just extractive in it itself for me to define really what that means. But in a sense, it's just using what they had done in the past and bringing that back to the forefront, bringing back the circles, bringing back just the talking about it, bringing back the traditional elements, and really not making it as so sterile and dry as the legal court systems are. It's really, you know, taking the time to just talk things out, taking the time to just gather together and solving the issues on a really local and hyper-focused issue, because I think that's also what goes into Indigenous cultures and Indigenous law. And really, yeah, just focusing on the next generations. I think that's a big part of Indigenous law, is they really believed in not just sustaining their life and their planet and their earth and their ground for them themselves. It always was a reciprocity for those that are coming after them. And that's what led their stewardship. That's what led their sustainability practices. And I think that's what has been missing in traditional adjudication now. It's while it is kind of for the people, it's for that person at that present moment, rather than what's going to happen in the next 20 years, what's going to happen in the next 5 years, etc. And so kind of hard question to answer, but that's how I view indigeneity. It's very different, it's very complex, but it's really bringing back, you know, what people were doing before the colonizers came, before kind of Western academics came and kind of told them how they should function, told them how they should act. I know in the United States, indigeneity is very difficult because all of our indigenous and native tribes have just been slaughtered and pushed away and migrated. I come from the South, like I've said, from Georgia, and we really the South doesn't have any tribes because of Andrew Jackson, because of the Trail of Tears and just pushing them all away into the West and the Midwest region. And now slowly we're starting to see more sovereignty, more land back movements and things like that, and more water rights movements. And even coming from Oregon, we actually just had this beautiful, amazing law passed that was on behalf and created and pushed by the indigenous communities there. Because we had this big, terrible dam that was a huge dam that was just blocking off the water supply. And what was happening is it was killing the local salmon. And so that was the main food source, but also that was the main economic source for these villages and for these tribes. And they were able to come together and be like, we need to get rid of this dam. And they were able to pass this big law. The dam finally got removed. The waters are flowing. The salmon are thriving. And so it's like, it's bringing it back to their solutions and really bringing it back to those people who have been just slaughtered, have been migrated, have been moved, and who have been silenced for over decades and centuries by these colonial oppressors, and really bringing back their traditional knowledge to really make the world as sustainable and as positive and as beautiful for the next generations to come.
Victoria, we have a lot of listeners that are young, maybe new to community organizing. Presumably many of them have campaigns, issues they're working on that have a legal angle. Can you give one piece of advice before we get off the podcast today?
One piece of advice for the youth. You have the power. You've always had the power. You always have the solutions. And you just need to keep raising your voice and fighting for it. I know the law is so inaccessible to youth and to young people. We barely are able to get into the courtrooms, but we are making the change. I mean, just for a United States focus, once again, I apologize for all the listeners, but in the U.S., a lot of our climate litigation and a lot of our activism and a lot of our movements come from the youth. We have Held versus Montana, we have Juliana versus the EP versus the U.S., and those are all youth-led cases. We have Navahin versus the DOA, the DOT happening in Hawaii, and so those are also youth cases where it's about ranges from like 16 to 30 youth plaintiffs that are coming together and really making change. And though it has been slow and a lot of their cases do get shut down and then brought back up on appeals and things like that, they are still doing things. They are still banding together. And you also have like the big Fridays for Futures movement. And so the youth movement is there. And also just speaking as a Georgian, we were talking earlier about like recent elections and things like that, and how Georgia recently turned blue in the last presidential election. And that was on the youth. That was on the BIPOC youth, and really getting together and using their voices and using their momentum, and also using their technology and their prowess in social media and things like that to really change the world and really get together. Youth are powerful. I've always been for the children. I believe the children are the future because we have the stories, we have the solutions, and we have this, I don't know, we have this way of thinking that is just so different from like adults or elders, and that we can see things differently, and like we are able to be more creative in our solutions. And so I think that's at the end of the day is just get creative, get loud, get out there. Don't be afraid of what might come. You are protected by your communities. You are protected by your goal. Justice is inevitable, and it really is just, you have the power, you have your story. Everybody's a storyteller. Everybody has a voice. Everybody has the right to stand up for what they believe in, and to just keep that close to your heart, and to never let that go. And also take care of yourself. Getting into this work and getting into activism and movement spaces can be very hard. It can be very draining, and burnout is very much real because you can see not much change happening, and it might not seem like you're doing anything on an individual level, but you are. So really take care of yourselves as you're entering this movement. One of my favorite quotes is from Audre Lorde. I love to live by it. And this is my favorite quote as an activist, as an organizer, which is self-care is a form of protest, and that in and of itself is political warfare. And so really take care of yourselves in this time, because if you're not taking care of yourselves, you can't take care of this movement that you want to be a part of. So be loud, be proud, take care of yourself, be creative, and change will come.
Thanks so much for joining us on Troublemakers, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Blessings in all of your quests.
Thank you. You as well.
Hi, we hope you enjoyed the conversation on this episode of Troublemakers and feel inspired to stir up some good trouble in your own community. Do feel free to check out our other episodes and subscribe to your preferred podcast app. You can follow us on Instagram at troublemakers.podcast for all the latest updates, behind the scenes content, and sneak peeks of what's coming next. We also love to hear from our listeners. You can write us an email, troublemakersthepodcast@gmail.com. And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, take a moment and share it with a friend or leave us a review. It really helps us grow our community of troublemakers. Keep shaking things up.